The men had survived the worst of Hitler's camps. They had endured years of captivity, starvation, forced labour, and the particular cruelty of waiting for a war to end. When it finally did, they were supposed to come home. They were supposed to be counted, processed, and returned to families who had been holding their breath since the telegrams arrived. But some of them never came back. Not in the weeks after victory, not in the months that followed. And George Patton, commanding one of the most powerful armies in Europe, found himself staring east at a problem that no tank, no artillery barrage, and no field order could solve. The war had ended. The missing had not returned. So where, exactly, had they gone? By the spring of 1945, the shape of Europe had been decided not only by battlefield outcomes, but by political agreements made at conference tables far from the front lines. The Yalta Conference in February of that year had produced, among other things, an agreement between the Allied powers and the Soviet Union regarding the exchange of liberated prisoners of war. On paper, the framework was practical. As Allied forces moved through Germany from the west and Soviet forces moved from the east, each side would liberate prisoner camps inside their respective zones. The prisoners would then be gathered, cared for, and returned to their countries of origin through designated exchange points. Patton was commanding the Third Army during this period, an instrument of war that had driven through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and deep into Germany, with a speed that remained almost without parallel in the European theatre. By April and May of 1945, his forces were positioned in territory that would become part of the American occupation zone. But the boundaries between Allied and Soviet-controlled areas were not always clean, not always honoured, and not always stable. American prisoners of war had been held across Germany and German-occupied territory. As the Reich collapsed, many of those camps fell inside zones that Soviet forces reached first. Under the Yalta Agreement, Soviet authorities were expected to gather those liberated American prisoners and facilitate their return. Patton's known attitude towards Soviet military culture, Soviet operational secrecy, and Soviet willingness to honour agreements made him, almost from the beginning, a sceptical observer of how that process would actually unfold. He had watched the Soviets operate. He had watched Allied command defer to Soviet sensitivities. And he had, by late 1945, more reason than most to believe the system was not working. The Yalta Prisoner Exchange Agreement sounded clean in principle. In practice, it developed complications almost immediately. American military authorities began receiving reports that liberated American POWs inside the Soviet zone were not being quickly returned. The channels that were supposed to facilitate movement were slow, inconsistent, and, at times, completely blocked. Soviet authorities controlled access to their zone. They controlled who could enter. They controlled which camps could be visited, which prisoner populations could be confirmed, and which reports could be transmitted. American officers seeking information about their men encountered what can best be described as a wall of procedural delay. The core contradiction was this: victory had been declared, an agreement had been signed, and American soldiers who had survived years of German captivity were now inside territory held by an ally. They should have been the easiest problem of the post-war period to solve. Instead, they became one of the most frustrating. The process that was supposed to return them home was moving through Soviet bureaucratic channels at a pace that left families waiting and commanders without answers. Patton's command style was built around one fundamental principle: movement. He did not tolerate unnecessary delay in military operations, and he had very little patience for bureaucratic obstruction when American lives were at stake. But the prisoner exchange problem was not a battlefield problem. It was a political problem wrapped inside a military framework, governed by an agreement that the Soviet side interpreted on its own terms. Patton could not order a division to recover missing men from a zone he did not control. He could not send reconnaissance units into Soviet territory. The walls around this problem were not made of concrete and wire. They were made of agreements, protocols, and the broader political imperative to maintain the alliance with the Soviet Union intact. At least for the moment, the men were still missing, and the system designed to find them was not giving answers. The scope of the problem was not immediately clear. In the immediate aftermath of German surrender, the logistical situation across Europe was nearly incomprehensible. Millions of displaced persons, prisoners of war, forced labourers, refugees, and surrendered soldiers were moving across a continent that had been systematically destroyed. Allied military authorities were managing a crisis of scale that had no real historical precedent. Some degree of confusion and delay was inevitable, but as weeks passed and the chaos of initial surrender began to give way to occupation administration, the explanation of chaos started to wear thin. Reports reaching American military channels suggested that a significant number of American prisoners of war had been liberated by Soviet forces in the final weeks of the war, processed through Soviet-controlled reception points, and then, in many cases, moved into the Soviet interior rather than transferred to American custody. The Yalta Agreement had designated specific exchange points, including the city of Odessa, where repatriated prisoners were to be handed over. Some Americans did pass through these channels. The records confirmed that. But the numbers did not account for every man who should have been there. That was the first layer of the problem. The numbers did not match. American military intelligence was attempting to reconstruct prisoner population figures using German records, Red Cross documentation, and survivor testimony. German records had been partially destroyed or lost in the final collapse. Red Cross access inside the Soviet zone was restricted, and survivor testimony, while valuable, created a picture that was incomplete by its nature. Men who had made it back could describe where they had been. They could not fully account for the men who had not arrived. The second layer was access. American liaison officers attempting to operate inside the Soviet zone encountered consistent resistance. Soviet authorities did not simply deny the existence of American prisoners. They used a more effective tool. They controlled the process so thoroughly that verification became nearly impossible. Requests for camp inspections moved through Soviet military bureaucracy at a pace that rendered them effectively useless. Lists of prisoners held in Soviet facilities were either unavailable or incomplete. When American officers pressed, the response was procedural. There were forms, there were channels, there were the right authorities to contact, and none of them were present, or available, or empowered to answer. By the time these patterns reached the command level, something had shifted in the way the problem was understood. The silence was becoming evidence. Patton's awareness of the Soviet military was not abstract. He had observed Soviet commanders operating at the margins of Allied coordination throughout the final campaign in Europe. He had, on multiple occasions, expressed views about Soviet intentions and Soviet operational methods that placed him well outside the diplomatic consensus his superiors were trying to maintain. Eisenhower's command structure was deeply invested in preserving Allied unity, at least through the occupation period. Washington was equally concerned about provoking Soviet sensitivities at a moment when the architecture of the post-war world was still being negotiated. Patton's instinct was the opposite. His known position was that Soviet intransigence responded to pressure, not accommodation. He was not wrong about the pattern. He was, however, very much out of step with official Allied policy. The political constraint was suffocating. American men were unaccounted for. Soviet authorities were not providing the access or the information needed to resolve that, and Patton was operating inside a command structure that had decided, for reasons he found inadequate, that pressing the Soviets too hard on prisoner exchange was not worth the political cost. That calculation enraged him, and the next refusal would change the meaning of victory entirely. The confrontation between Patton's instincts and the reality of post-war Allied politics reached its sharpest point in the months following German surrender. Patton was by this time commanding American forces in the occupation period, responsible for territory, policy, and the enormously complex problem of administering a defeated nation. But the prisoner question did not leave him. It tracked alongside every other administrative crisis, like a wound that could not be closed. What Patton understood, and what the diplomatic architects above him were reluctant to acknowledge, was that the Soviet approach to prisoner exchange was not simply disorganized. It was controlled. Soviet military administration in 1945 was not capable of casual oversight at this scale. The prisoner populations inside the Soviet zone were known. The camps that had been liberated were documented in Soviet military records. The decision about which prisoners to return quickly, which to delay, and which to absorb into Soviet labor systems was, accounts suggest, not random. It followed a logic. And that logic was not compatible with the Yalta Agreement as the Americans understood it. There is evidence in the historical record that some American and Allied prisoners who passed through Soviet hands were not immediately repatriated. Some were held for weeks or months beyond any reasonable logistical explanation. Some entered Soviet labor systems either through deliberate Soviet policy or through the brutal administrative chaos of a Soviet military structure that did not distinguish carefully between categories of displaced persons. The exact numbers remain genuinely contested by historians. What is clear is that the accounting was never fully complete. Patton did not wait well. That much is preserved in every account of his command style across the entire war. He had pushed through France when ordered to slow. He had driven toward the Rhine on instinct. He had consistently treated bureaucratic resistance as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a boundary to be respected. But the Soviet zone was not a front line, and Washington was not interested in a new conflict opening where the last one had just closed. The answer, when it came down through channels, was essentially no. No to independent American verification inside the Soviet zone. No to unilateral pressure on Soviet military authorities. No to the kind of direct confrontation that Patton believed the situation required. The men were still missing. The war had ended on paper, not for them. Patton was not silent about his views. His known statements during the occupation period about Soviet intentions, about Allied policy, and about the handling of the post-war settlement placed him in direct tension with Eisenhower and with the broader Allied command. He was eventually removed from command of the Third Army in the fall of 1945, reassigned to a position with no operational authority. The official reasons centred on other controversies. But the full picture of Patton's friction with command during this period cannot be separated from his refusal to accept that the problems of the post-war settlement were being handled adequately. He was injured in an automobile accident in December 1945 and died within days. He never saw the end of the accounting he had demanded. The question of American and Allied prisoners absorbed by the Soviet system did not disappear with the end of the occupation period. It became one of the foundational, unresolved tensions of the early Cold War. American veterans organizations, families of missing men, and military investigators continued to press the issue through the late 1940s and into subsequent decades. The Soviet Union consistently denied holding American prisoners beyond the immediate post-war repatriation period. The denials were, in many cases, supported by incomplete evidence on both sides. The fullest historical engagement with this question came in stages. In the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, joint American-Russian commissions were established to examine the fate of American POWs who may have passed through Soviet custody. Russian archives were partially opened. What emerged confirmed what accounts had long suggested, that some American and Allied prisoners had entered the Soviet system and were not immediately returned. The full extent remained, and in some respects remains, unclear. Russian archival access proved inconsistent. Full accountability was never achieved. The political cost of the prisoner exchange failure was significant in ways that played out slowly. It contributed to the atmosphere of distrust that accelerated the Cold War's early formation. It demonstrated, in one of its earliest post-war examples, that Soviet cooperation with Western allies operated on Soviet terms, and served Soviet interests, and it established a pattern of denial, delay, and controlled access that would define Soviet-Western relations for decades. Patton's reputation as a man who saw that pattern clearly and who refused to accept diplomatic accommodation as a substitute for accountability became one of the more complicated elements of his historical legacy. He was right about the problem. He was removed before he could force it into the open. There is a principle that Patton's story forces into the open, one that does not belong only to 1945, or to the specific geography of the Soviet zone, or the specific failure of a prisoner exchange agreement. It is this: the end of a war is not the same as the resolution of a war. Victory is a political declaration. Accountability is a human obligation. And the distance between those two things can be vast enough to swallow the missing whole. The men who did not come back from the Soviet zone were not forgotten by everyone. Patton was not the only officer who pressed for answers, not the only American who understood that the numbers did not add up. But he was perhaps the most powerful figure who refused to treat the political inconvenience of the question as a reason to stop asking it. In a command structure that had decided Allied unity was worth more than Allied accountability, that refusal made him dangerous. The deeper lesson of this story is not about Patton's flaws or his conflicts with superiors. Though both were real and documented, the deeper lesson is about what happens when powerful institutions decide that asking certain questions creates more problems than leaving them unanswered. The prisoners who never came home had earned the right to be counted. Their families had earned the right to know. And the silence that swallowed the full accounting of their fate was not an accident. It was a choice made by men in rooms far from the wire who decided that the political architecture of the peace mattered more than the truth of what the war had cost. Patton's final war was not against Germany. It was against the idea that victory gave powerful men the right to stop answering questions. He lost that war. The missing were never fully counted, and the silence outlasted him by decades.